How's everyone doing at the live stream and here in Hilo? Mahalo for coming out so early on a Friday morning. And what we'll be looking at today is water as a human right. And one of the things we'll be looking at, as you can see with the presentation, it's actually the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So all year, everyone's using the hashtag #StandUpForHumanRights. And what we're going to do today is really bring a synthesis about solidarity among one another, among people, as well as a synthesis for sustainability, and bringing those two together with this presentation. And so what we'll be looking at here is a history, a holistic history of water as a human right, but also water in the new UN global goals, but then also bring it together of what you can do and how internationally people are organizing, really from the island to the international perspective, to ensure their water is a human right. So if we're looking at the issue here, we'll go to our first part there. Very important slide, really coming from the struggle in Flint, Michigan. We see this in the United States where people are beginning to use the human rights framework because its human rights-based approach roots it in the community. It roots it in the community. It puts the duty on the country as well to uphold, but then also brings in the international moral legal standard to make sure we uphold these international rules that have been developed under the United Nations. Another important point about this, though, is look how far back it goes. As we are celebrating the 70th anniversary, when they came together in 1948 and they adopted this important Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it really pointed out some important things, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So for the first time ever, people have a standing in international law. It's not only countries, but more importantly, countries have a duty to uphold these rights for their people. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's 30 articles, and we're just going to show you 3 of them that point out how you link water in there. Second one is everyone is entitled to a social international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration are achieved. Quite crucial and important. That's the final one. But the other one there, 22, looking at the standard of living, is absolutely crucial because it looks at that important issue. But it's not only there. Here, if you look, it shows how we've been able to link up the Sustainable Development Goals here, Sustainable Development Goal number 6, with international human rights law. So the UDHR, very crucial, very important, established in 1948, but also the other core covenants and conventions. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and finally the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Also, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that's also commemorating its 10th year, is also pointed out in Article 29.2. So here you can see an overview of international human rights law and how we link up the right to water there. One important point as well, though, water as a human right, it also was officially recognized in July 28, 2010. There's a resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly, 64/292. So you can see here that the world recognized water as a human right, and the people of the world demanded water as a human right. Now, it's important to know our rights, because if we don't know our rights, we can't demand our rights. But it's also important to know what instruments and institutions that we can go to exercise these rights. So one big one that's quite important is the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR. The reason the UPR is important for us to use is you can use anything in the UN Charter. You can use anything in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can use anything your country's ratified, and you can also use anything that any UN agency has ever written about your country. So for the United States recently, the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty visited in December. You can use the words and the language from there in the reporting process. Also, any UN agency, UNICEF, UNESCO, all of those can be used. So the UPR is essential because, one, it's every 4.5 years. Every country is reviewed around the world. So no matter who you are, no matter where you live in the world, you can use the UPR review process. The UPR review process is great because we, civil society, begin the entire process. We write the first report. That means you can focus on what's wrong in your country, but you can also focus on what we want and aim for it from that perspective as aspiration, what we really think we need, and then to put pressure on our government to live up to that. And that is the first phase, is preparation. The second phase is interaction. We interact with other governments around the world, meet with them to make sure they put pressure on our own country during the 3.5-hour review of the UPR in Geneva. The second is consideration. Consideration is the important point because after you've done preparation and interaction, consideration is the actual 3.5-hour review. And just like the live webcast we're doing today across the world, anyone, anywhere in the world can view that. So for the last review that we had people in Flint, Michigan, we had people in Waiʻi, Hawaiʻi, watching this, waiting to see if their question or recommendation was raised. Then after that, it's the adoption of the report. The UN Human Rights Council adopts the report at the following meeting, and that's when we then can begin the final phase of, after adoption, implementation. And so you can see how we organize together. And some of you might have different breakfasts. Some of you might have those sandwiches you do, the croissant-wich. And that's kind of what we do. We do a state sandwich. You organize from the grassroots up, and you bring the global down, and you make sure we sort of squeeze the truth out, and you can push for water as a human right. So that's quite important to just look overview. I'm going to give you a couple brief other ways that we can use water as a human right. Governments also ratify treaties. So the one treaties we talked about there, the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the Covenant on the Rights of the Child, the International Bill of Rights for Women, CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, all these have water as a human right. When a country is being reviewed, there's experts, between 18 and 23 experts that review every country that have ratified these treaties. So when the review comes up, you can use the exact same 5 phases we talked about earlier. Preparation, meeting in the community, interaction with the experts to then be able to ask the questions in this case, the consideration. The reviews in this case are even better. They're 5 or 6 hours depending on which treaty body we're looking at. Then we'll have the actual after consideration, the adoption and implementation. So you can use those 5 phases for everything. But we don't have to wait until a review of a country at a universal periodic review or at one of the treaty bodies. The UN Human Rights Council, which replaced the Commission on Human Rights in 2008, it actually now meets 3 times a year. It meets in February, March, so it's coming up very soon at the end of this month. It meets again in June, and it meets again in September. It meets for a total of 10 weeks, and during those weeks, they have different rapporteurs. The special rapporteurs or independent experts or working groups cover actually 47 different themes, and the right to water is one of them. There's also right to combat extreme poverty. So there's many different themes that we can organize around. There's even a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, which are usually a lot of the cases of water rights because corporations are coming in to try to get access to their land, which then, of course, would pollute their pristine waters. So we can see how we can use all of these international instruments, those conventions, as well as the Human Rights Council, which meets 3 times a year, giving you an opportunity 3 times a year to bring up issues. The good news as well about the special rapporteur and independent experts and working groups is you can also send emails to them any time of the day, any day of the year you want to. So it's really important to know these exist. And as far as indigenous peoples go, I know we have different indigenous peoples around the world that have tuned in. There's 3 important instruments related to indigenous peoples. The first one is the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. There's 16 independent experts. These independent experts look at issues around the world. And this summer, we're actually looking at land and looking at the issue of land and water. So it's important to look at 2 studies that was done, one on biodiversity and nature, and one on sustainable development and indigenous peoples. So all of these exist, and they're all available that we can look at and begin to coordinate our actions. The other thing besides the Permanent Forum that meets for 2 weeks this year is the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. It's been just revised in the last year. Now, the 5 experts of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples can actually visit communities, and will be able to visit at least 2 countries a year. The last one is the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, Vicky Tali-Corpus from the Philippines, and she can receive submissions at any time. She also has 2 country visits. So we've seen this done in a lot of good ways, beginning with Jim Anaya, looking at multinational corporations and their impacts on indigenous peoples' lands. So that's a brief overview of the human rights, and I look forward to answering more questions. But we're going to move into the next aspect when we're also looking at water and sustainable development goals. So in Hawaii, we're very fortunate. We also have the Aloha Challenge. The Aloha Challenge was adopted 1 year prior to the Sustainable Development Goals being adopted in September of 2015. And we also have, as you can see behind me, that we are still in the Paris Agreement. So we'll go through these as well to look at some ways that we can be involved and what else we can do. With the Aloha Plus Challenge, there's 2 of those that we can look at, natural resources and other aspects. Here's, of course, a beautiful aspect of the water we do share. There, of course, the important issue that points out how everything is linked up between water and land. Here we look at the issue of kalo and the lo'i, and we know if the water isn't flowing, the kalo doesn't grow as big. So it's important to look at these issues and understand them. Of course, water and its importance in Hawaii is known since ancestral times with, of course, vai-vai, meaning wealth, and looking at those important issues. Getting past the Aloha Plus Challenge is very important. It's an important aspect to incorporate into our actions. And we can follow that with the dashboard. But also the Sustainable Development Goals are quite exciting because when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's when for the first time they ask people to get out of those silos. So starting to get to what we were talking about of that solidarity and that synthesis between solidarity and sustainability. It's people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership all connected. And the important thing when you look at these goals, you can see how they're all connected. Clean water and sanitation is the one most people are aware of when looking at water. It makes the most sense. It's the one that you see Matt Damon with when he's promoting Stella Artois and things like that. That's how most people may become familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. But definitely linked with climate action, definitely linked with life below water, and definitely linked with life on land. So all of these point out how people are working to preserve and protect their water. And of course, what's really important though with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's not just environment. It's also human rights and it's justice. So it points out that people have basic rights. One, that aspect of free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples, that they can actually determine when and how people would interact with them on their sacred lands. But the other one that's also there is the right to be informed and be able to participate in decision-making in countries. So that's absolutely quite crucial as well. So 16 was one many governments did not want. They said, we're talking about sustainable development. What does it have to do with peace and justice? But you could see here situations where people came together to demand these rights, even when many governments didn't want to. Even was the case with the right to water. Looking at water as a human right and including a separate goal, it was only because of the work of the Mining Working Group, a group of NGOs around the world that focus at the headquarters in UN, working in partnership with indigenous peoples, as well as the ambassador of Palau, that when governments were trying to get rid of this goal, that then the ambassador of Palau, in the final hours of the negotiations in the wee mornings of August of 2015, said he sees the finish line, as they were talking about this being a marathon, but he says, I can't get to the finish line if I don't have water. And he used that humor, but also that wit to demand water as a human right and to be included. What's quite crucial as well, though, is besides the important aspects of what exists with these UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's also the Paris Agreement. And the reason we're bringing these both up is that with both of these instruments, there are ways that we can participate, just like with the human rights instruments. With climate change and with sustainable development, there's different ways people can participate. So for the issue, if we look at Sustainable Development Goals, there's a brand new process known as the UN High-Level Political Forum, or the HLPF. The HLPF meets every summer. This summer, I've been working on 4 case studies. We're working with Aboriginals in Australia and Torres Strait Islanders, First Nations in Canada, Laos, and Vietnam. So what will happen is each one of those countries will prepare a report saying how they're meeting those 17 goals. What's really important for us, though, is people movements coming together to give more accurate assessment of what's taking place in our communities and around the country. And then being able to share, if you're looking at those 17 goals, what's good and what's bad. So we're working with indigenous peoples to say which one of these goals is in the worst condition possible. So they'll be identifying either 6 or 16 and raising those. But besides that, it's also then saying what you want. So this goals are all linked up, and goal number 17 is partnership. So this allows indigenous peoples to work directly with other governments that care about specific issues to then work and assist with those. So we're looking at the issue of high-level political forum. We know right now in one village where indigenous peoples live in Kampuchea Kram, in the southern part of Vietnam in the Mekong Delta, they need clean water. They've seen their rice paddies of clean water be infiltrated with rising sea level, so they can't grow their crops anymore. So these crops that used to grow, no longer the case. You see that as well with Pacific Islanders. You see in the situation of Tuvalu, No longer can they grow their taro or their kalo because you can see the salt water just percolating up through the ground, getting into the fresh water. So we see these issues happening. So then that alerts the rest of the world, this is our biggest challenge. If our right to water is being denied, then it's right to food. If they don't have the right diet that they've had since time immemorial, then it goes to right to health. So you can see how all these rights are linked up and why we have to keep organizing in that way. This voluntary national review takes place every summer in July. And this year, that's why we're concentrating on those 4 countries, Australia, Canada, and also looking at the situation in Laos and Vietnam. But every country in the world will be reviewed every 5 years between now and 2030. So it's really important to know about the voluntary national reviews and the high-level political forum, just as important as the universal periodic review on the human rights side. And that gets us to our final part. And I know we have a lot of speakers today, but if you look at the "we are still in," that's quite important. Because as the current administration said they were moving out of the Paris Agreement, Hawaii worked on a resolution that we worked on with our students to make sure that we adopted the Paris Agreement. So Hawaii, the University of Hawaii, as David Lasner pointed out again yesterday, we're still into the Paris Agreement, and this is, of course, the logo of what we're working on. All this international law, though, sometimes is very confusing to people. So what we do at the Hawaii Institute for Human Rights and with the Office of Sustainability is we simplified it. So here, you can see human rights is mentioned in paragraph 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 13. That's the preambulary paragraph that focus on human rights and recognizing that. But what's really important is Article 2. Article 2 was the work of the Pacific Coalition. What the Pacific Island states did is they said, we're not small island developing states. That's being imposed upon us. We're large ocean nations. And it's one of those moments when you're here in Hilo, you remember the words of Epeli Hau'ofi with our Sea of Islands as he drove here to a conference. He recognized how really the ocean connects us, the same way that human rights and sustainable development goals also connects humanity. And he points out here, the Pacific Island states said this is a matter of life and death. So they organized the High Ambition Coalition, led by the Marshall Islands, Ambassador de Broom, unfortunately, who has passed away. But he pointed out, we have to go to 1.5, and we can't stop at 2. So he worked with Pacific Island NGOs, 350 Pacific, pretty powerful. They're saying, we are not drowning, we are rising. And very important work that they did there. But throughout this document, you can see ways we need this. Article 4, nationally determined contributions. Every 5 years, countries will be reviewed. We can then bring forward and bring the issues underneath this Paris Agreement on the issues we care about and be able to bring those forward to the review that takes place every 5 years for all countries. The other one, though, that's very important here for the university is Article 12. Article 12 was looking at education. So we have to have moments like this where we organize to build the movement around human rights, sustainable development, and climate justice. And when you look at that issue there of 12, it's what we're doing here with this Sustainability Summit for Higher Education in Hawaii. It's pointing out that we have to educate people about climate change, but more importantly about their rights so they can demand the world that they desire in this world. So we also then can look here. This is an example of what was organized with students at University of Hawaii at Manoa. After the Bonn Climate Summit that was hosted by Fiji, we had a meeting at the end of the year to bring together the new mayor's office on resilience with the governor's office that's focusing on the Paris Agreement and we're still in, to say what they did when they went to Bonn, but more importantly, what are they working on here in Hawaii so that we make sure we reach the Paris Agreement, which then ensures that we have rights to fresh water as well as climate justice. Here's an example, too, of getting youth involved. Here we had a class that we taught last semester, Sustainable Development in Oceania. In that class, the students didn't have a final exam where they would write. They actually presented about what they learned about sustainable development. Here you can see them bringing up Sustainable Development Goal number 6 and how important it is in Oceania. There, of course, you can see how they also show, though, we can't do this just through law. It's also culture. And there we have Kathy from the Marshall Islands doing her famous speech at the UN Climate Summit. And they point out her poetry really did move people, where she talked about what she was doing for her new baby and how the world was actually marching with her. That was the weekend of the climate march throughout New York City. And it was the time that the world really came together a couple months before Paris. And here in Hawaii, of course, we have to wake up every day and realize this planet, this island, is the most important place in the world, and we have to work together with all people to protect our planet. And we've looked at it from the legal perspective, and we talked about it, but we also have the moral on our side as well. If you look at Pope Francis' recent encyclical on climate change, he points out access to safe drinking water is a basic and universal human right, since it is essential to human survival and as such is a condition for the exercise of other human rights. So all these rights are interconnected, but we all know water is one of the most important ones because we can't survive more than 2 days without water. You can see that situation even coming to bear already. It's not some type of apocalyptic future. We had the people of Tuvalu waiting for boats to come after a recent natural disaster, and on that boat was water because they had run out. On a good note, though, it's exciting to see one of the other aspects of the Paris Agreement is adaptation. Indigenous peoples are going back to traditional ways that have been lost due to colonization and reaching out to those ancestral ways with the wisdom to reconnect with the earth. That also points the path forward of where we can go and how we should do that. Here we are there in New York looking at number, of course, 16 with human rights there. But here's an important point. This was quite crucial, and it points out how Hawaiʻi is at the forefront. Here you can see different offices of Hawaiʻi. We have Hawaii Green Growth, Office of Sustainability, our elected officials, our senators, and the governor's office saying we're still in. And now, what I'd like to close with is it's exciting to see what's going on at the state legislature. We actually have a bill, many bills actually, introduced to have sustainable development goals as law in Hawaii. So it's a tradition of what we have done. When I started teaching, we worked on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Hawaii became the first state to adopt that. We also then became a state of human rights as well, being the only state. But that built on the movement of human rights cities that you could look at doing in our different islands. So we can organize on Kauai, here in Hilo, but we have human rights cities. And now, besides the Paris Agreement last year, right now the state Senate has made it a priority package to adopt all 17 goals. The omnibus bill is SB 2661, but after that, it's the next 17 bills that are being adopted. So you can submit testimony on it. You can write about the one related to water that you care about the most, if that's the one that you care about, but you can focus on any of the 17. There's also resolution, Senate Resolution 11. That's also looking at adopting the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can see Hawaii is at the forefront. We're doing many activities to make sure that we respect the spirit and the principle of aloha aina, and that we move forward together. So I want to stop there, and I'll be able to then make sure that we have some time for questions and also for our next speaker. So that's where we are. So mahalo, thank you very much. And we just want you to be able to be aware that water is a human right. It's been adopted since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights all the way up through the General Assembly in 2010. You can see then with the Sustainable Development Goals, everybody knows there's 17 goals, but there's also 169 targets and 220 indicators. And that then shows how we realize these rights and what we need to do to put pressure on our public officials, but also to defend ourselves against multinational corporations aiming to privatize and make sure that we understand that water is a human right and coordinate for a better future in that capacity. So mahalo, thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions from the Meeting Sift. So if you are logged into Meeting Sift, you can put in questions for Joshua Cooper as an opportunity to ask about legal perspectives on water as a human right. Joshua spoke about moral and ethical imperatives, and also situations that he mentioned around the world. Tuvalu, and one of the questions that came in was about how, like in a situation like Tuvalu, where you mentioned there was a natural disaster, they ran out of water. So what happens from a legal or human rights perspective in a situation like that, or like Flint, Michigan, or the upcoming water deadline in Cape Town? What, from a legal or human rights perspective, what would the course of action be like?
Right. So I think what's really important is it's from a prevention perspective. Human rights isn't something where you wait till there's a violation, and that's the important point there. It's forecasting and looking at possible alternative futures. So I think what's really strong is in situations, that's why you saw the Paris Agreement. The nations of the Pacific knew if we didn't do anything now, it would be even worse in the future. So that's why that article was there, to then set up that system. That then allows them to put pressure at upcoming meetings, but also for every country to aim towards that goal. If they didn't have that framework, then that's the problem there. The other point, though, that's also crucial is people can then look at what to do now. If you look at the human rights framework, it provides the path forward to make sure that our fundamental freedoms are not denied. And so looking at the situation of Cape Town, Cape Town's a situation is by Earth Day this year, Cape Town could run entirely out of water and be seen sort of an apocalyptic situation where people are waiting in lines for water, something that people couldn't even imagine. And so what they're looking at now is what is the right to water? What is the reason it's being prevented? And so it's looking at the environmental side, but usually what's really important with a lot of these situations is it's a public policy decision. So it's putting pressure on elected officials to make sure that they understand it's a right that they have to meet. And it also then provides a space where people can organize around that. It's not something that you just wait till there's no water. You organize at every stage what's going on at the community level, demanding your rights. So the interesting thing with Flint, Michigan, is that situation had been going on for 2 years. It wasn't until the people started to organize it as water as a human right that they then started using the international instruments. They brought in the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Water. All of a sudden, the U.S. is embarrassed that the world knows that people in Flint, Michigan don't have water, that the water is poison. Then the government starts taking action. But more importantly, too, the people aren't going there. It's like charity of like, we'd like water. Could you please help us? They know it's a fundamental right that they have, and that's the duty. Why have a government if it's not fulfilling its duty to its people? And so they use that approach. Also then the courts. It's that threat in America where people are worried about getting lawsuits that you can then use the courts and go beyond just the moral compassion and pushing things, but also using those courts to then enforce the law. So you can see it, one, as a unifying tool to mobilize people to demand their rights. Two, then to be able to coordinate campaigns that then put the pressure, because unfortunately our officials don't always do what's just right. So we have to organize to then get our officials to do the right thing. And then, of course, finally, if they aren't doing something, then to use the legal mechanisms as redress to then improve the situation. And what's important, too, with human rights is they actually look at impact and then future generations. So one other example took place in Chicago. In Chicago, they've been torturing people for decades. And so what they then came up with was a brand new legislation actually providing reparations for children of the people who were tortured and put it in holistic terms of that they actually had college for life, for learning on how to solve the post-traumatic stress syndrome and other aspects. So human rights is a holistic remedy. It's not just that there's a monetary amount. It's that, one, you have to make sure that the right is realized, and two, though, that it's holistic and seen in its entirety.
Thank you so much, Joshua.
No problem.